Good afternoon, good evening, welcome, whatever time zone you happen to be in. My name is Atalia Omer. I'm a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Today, I have the great honor to introduce to you Professor Michael Rothberg, who is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Rothberg works in the fields of Holocaust studies, trauma and memory studies, critical theory and cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and contemporary literatures. He is an amazingly prolific writer who has influenced and intersected with multiple disciplines. His earlier book, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, which was published in 2009 by Stanford University Press, has deeply influenced my own work on efforts by Jews, specifically American Jews, to grapple with their memories and histories, not through a zero-sum prism, and by centralizing concerns with historical injustice and social and political justice, as well as interrogating the enduring legacy of Europe, not Europe as a geography, but as a political and intellectual project of coloniality. Today, Professor Rothberg will be speaking about his most recent book, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, which was also published by Stanford University Press in 2019. In some respects, the current book continues some themes developed in multidirectional memory, and in other respects, it moves in different directions that quite explicitly connects with some of the concerns and basic themes that have animated peace research and peace practice for a long time. The concepts and categories of perpetrators and victims, their binarization is challenged in this book in profound ways, which Professor Rothberg will present to us momentarily. After Professor Rothberg will present the main arguments of his book, my colleague, Professor Ernesto Verdeja, will offer a brief response and a few questions for further discussion. Professor Verdeja is an associate professor of political science and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. His areas of expertise include political violence, transitional justice, forgiveness and reconciliation. His research has focused on large-scale political violence. We're talking about genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, transitional justice, forgiveness, apologies, truth commissions, and other such justice-oriented mechanisms. Professor Verdeja is a political theorist, also a prolific author and a gifted award-winning teacher. On top of it all, he also serves currently as the executive director of the Institute for the Study of Genocide. So before we proceed, just a few housekeeping details. Participants may type in their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Please don't use the chat, as that will be used only for any technical issues participants are experiencing. We will try to ask as many of the questions posed as possible and apologize in advance if we don't have time to get to your question, but please know that we will share your question with the panelists. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be available on our website at the Kroc Institute shortly for viewing and sharing. Let us now proceed, but before we do, I wanted to acknowledge my presence here in South Bend, Indiana, on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. And now, without further ado, let me welcome Professor Rothberg to the virtual stage. Mm-hmm. Michael, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Atalia, for the invitation and for that really generous and warm introduction. And thank you also to Lisa Gallagher from the Kroc Institute for making this possible. And let me thank Ernesto Verdeja for agreeing to serve as a respondent. Both Atalia and Ernesto are doing work that is very relevant to what I see myself as doing as well. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Let me share my screen. I've got a few slides. I'm going to try to, in a relatively brief presentation of about 20 or 25 minutes, present a few of the main arguments of my book, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to do that. I want to join Atalia as well in acknowledging that here in what we call Los Angeles today, I'm also on the land of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples, and that unceded territory is what we know today as Los Angeles, and I want to acknowledge that these are the traditional land caretakers of this area, and that question of acknowledgement is also and is central to my talk as well, as you'll see in just a moment. So this is a book that both comes out of scholarly and very personal context for me. And Atalia mentioned my previous book, Multidirectional Memory, which was an attempt to think in kind of entangled ways about the memories of historical violence, in particular, the way that memory of the Holocaust has always been entangled with memory of colonialism and slavery. And I traced that from the immediate post-war period up into the present. And my focus there was very much on the way that different histories of victimization have been perceived together and have developed in some ways in conversation with each other, at least in terms of remembrance. And what I started to do after finishing Multidirectional Memory was to think about other ways that histories intersect and come together, sometimes even more uncomfortable ways. And that's what led me to what I would call the implicated subject, and which I'll explain in a moment. And this also had very personal autobiographical meaning for me. The book was an attempt to really address questions that I'd been thinking about for many decades, in fact, about what it means to be a white Jewish American man in the US, faced on the one hand with the founding crimes of this country, of slavery, and of the genocide of indigenous peoples, and to try to think what my position in relationship to that is as someone born long after the end of slavery, born long after the initial conquest of the Americas, and yet still bearing some sort of responsibility for those histories. And it also came out of, and this speaks to Atalia's work as well, reflections on what it meant to be a Jewish American in relationship to the state of Israel and the occupation of Palestine, and to try to think again about what kind of responsibility I bear as a diasporic subject for the occupation and for that particular national project. And I hope it'll be clear what those questions have to do with what I'm going to talk about today. What I realized, though, in coming back to some of these issues many years later, after starting to think about them, was that I lacked a kind of conceptual framework and a vocabulary for really addressing the sorts of issues that I thought were important in relationship to slavery, to genocide, indigenous genocide, to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And it was only really in reading, in the context of my work in Holocaust studies, the book by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers on the question of German guilt, that I started to develop a kind of framework for thinking about these issues. And Jaspers was writing immediately after the Holocaust, the defeat of National Socialism, and he was trying to convince his fellow country people that they bore some sort of responsibility for what just had happened. And he argues against the notion of collective guilt, but he argues in favor of a kind of differentiated understanding of guilt that I came to find very productive for thinking about the questions that concern me as well. So he distinguishes between what he calls criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and metaphysical guilt. Criminal guilt is the guilt of the individual perpetrator, right? If you commit a crime, you are criminally guilty and you are individually responsible for that. But he says, he said, not most Germans were not criminally guilty of what just had happened, and yet they would be described as politically guilty in his terms. In other words, by virtue of their membership in the German collective, by virtue of their citizenship as Germans, they bore a kind of political responsibility for what had just happened. And he also, that is the term that proved most useful for me, but moral guilt is also one in which we are we are responsible for our actions individually, regardless of the legal system in which we are living, regardless of the mores of the culture in which we're living. There's still a kind of moral guilt that accrues to us potentially. And a metaphysical guilt is a kind of very globalized notion of guilt in which we are guilty for basically anything that happens anywhere in the world at any moment in time. And that one I found less useful. I also ultimately found that the discourse of guilt, or the category of guilt, was not so useful for me. And here I drew then on Hannah Arendt as well, who kind of shifts the conversation away from guilt and toward the problem of responsibility. And it was precisely through Arendt's rereading of Jaspers and the development of her own ideas that I started to think, no, this is really about political responsibility and historical responsibility. So what Jaspers calls political guilt, I call political responsibility, and then I add a historical dimension, because I think it's important to think about these terms, as I'll say more in a moment, in diachronic historical terms, not just in terms of what happens in the present. So this leads me then to introduce a few of the theses that I develop in the course of the book, and that I kind of lay out, especially clearly in the conclusion as well. And I start from this very simple point, that we need to enlarge our understanding of the actors involved in injustices and violence beyond the most often invoked figures of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. So especially coming out of Holocaust studies, these are the categories that we've been working with: victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. And especially in terms of victims and perpetrators, I'm not saying that we leave them behind, but that they need to be supplemented. And in particular, the category of the bystander I find to be a weak category, because it implies a kind of passivity and lack of involvement, which is, I think, doesn't really well describe the kinds of political responsibility that many people bear in different histories of violence, exploitation, and injustice. So essentially, in place of this weak notion, what I call the weak notion of the bystander, I offer this notion of the implicated subject, which is meant to get at the way that people who are not immediate direct perpetrators, in other words, not criminally guilty, nevertheless enable, perpetuate, benefit from, and inherit in different ways histories and actualities of violence and injustice. And I call that figure the implicated subject. And I want to emphasize that I consider the implicated subject not an identity, not an essential identity especially, but rather a subject position. In other words, it's a position that we occupy in relationship to specific histories, specific structures and systems. And it's getting at that specificity that I think is really crucial. And that recognizes that these positions shift and that they're multiple, right? That we occupy multiple positions in relationship to multiple histories, and that histories are precisely the things that are changing and dynamic, and therefore our positions are always shifting as well. But to be implicated means, if you look etymologically, to be folded into, right? To be folded into events and structures. And it bears there an etymological and also a conceptual kinship with the notion of complicity. Though in the book, I also try to distinguish these and offer implication as a kind of alternative to complicity, a term that has been used in very useful ways by a number of thinkers recently, but I find still too close to the legal notion of criminal guilt in Jaspers's terms. I'm trying to get a little bit away from that, so I offer a new term there. For me, the implicated subject is a kind of transmission belt of domination, taking that from the Italian philosopher Simone Forti. Again, trying to emphasize not the direct perpetrator, but one who participates in, indirectly transmits various forms of domination and violence. And I want to give an example here quickly, which is one that I don't really develop in the book, but which I think I hope can be illuminated by this framework of implication and implicated subjects. And that's the example of sexual violence. And so when I say in the subtitle to my book, Beyond Perpetrators, Victims and Perpetrators, what do I mean? What does it mean to move beyond victims and perpetrators? I want to again emphasize that what I'm not saying is that we should get rid of those categories altogether. That especially if we think about this example, sexual violence, we know very well how important it is to recognize and hold accountable perpetrators, and to recognize and to offer some sort of possibilities for healing, for justice, for those who are victims of sexual violence. Those categories are essential in this case and in the other cases that I discuss in my book as well. But I want to ask if they're sufficient for understanding this phenomena, for understanding it, and ultimately, of course, for combating it. And so what I'm asking is, what happens when we shift our point of view and we look beyond the central characters in this scenario of victims and perpetrators, and especially beyond the perpetrator, at those who enable and make possible these forms of sexual violence? And I take this example, which was, I think, published in the Atlantic magazine. And I'm not trying to suggest that all of the people identified in this image are what I'm calling implicated subjects, but I thought it was a nice way of, again, broadening the frame and asking who else is part of these scenarios of violence, who else is enabling them, who else is perpetuating them, who else is responsible for the impunity that often follows from such acts of sexual violence and other forms of violence as well. So we're thinking about friends and colleagues, lawyers and politicians. My mind these days is also very much on gun violence, and I think you could do a similar analysis of that form of violence and say, of course there are victims and of course there are perpetrators, but there's a whole set of other people who enable those forms of violence, especially politicians, lobbyists, et cetera, et cetera. This is an image, remember this guy, Trump mocking Christine Blasey Ford at a rally in Mississippi shortly after those hearings. And what interests me here is actually not Trump himself, but the audience. And the glee and the joy that you see on the faces of those people. And to me, this is precisely an indication of why the bystander is not sufficient for understanding what's going on in scenes like this. These are implicated subjects whose behaviors are in fact enabling of these forms of violence, right, and contributing to their repetition and the fact that they happen again and again and are often met with impunity. So sexual violence is an example of a form of violence, obviously, that happens in a present, right? It's a present day form of violence, not, of course, existing throughout time, but when it happens, it's happening in the present. But what I argue in the book is that we need to think about implication both in terms of that contemporary moment, what I call synchronic implication, but also historically. We have to think about diachronic implication as well. So implication happens along these two axes. The axes are certainly intertwined and sometimes inseparable, but I guess I've found it and continue to find it useful analytically to make this distinction between the synchronic form of implication and the diachronic form of implication. And I believe, and I'll try to show, that that can help to illuminate different scenarios of violence and domination. And if you think back to those autobiographical examples I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, I would think of something like implication in slavery as an example of diachronic implication, but something like the ongoing occupation of Palestine would be a form of synchronic implication. So this is simplifications, and these histories are all complicated and need further unpacking, but just to give you a kind of sense of what I'm talking about. And I've tried to visualize what I mean here in terms of these different forms of implication. I hope that this is helpful. So synchronic on the left, diachronic on the right, you'll see that they're overlapping, and they're overlapping because some forms of implication, I think, work very nicely on both axes of implication. Other ones exist precisely at places where it may be impossible to untangle the synchronic from the diachronic, and I try to make that visible here. So my example of a synchronic implicated subject is something like an enabler, right? Someone who makes possible a certain form of violence without actually, again, pulling the trigger, being themselves directly responsible. So a bureaucrat, an onlooker who looks away, someone who looks away, someone who justifies violence that's happening somewhere else, someone who participates in a system like global capitalism, which is producing poverty and exploitation in some places, riches and privilege in other places. That also takes us to this notion of the beneficiary, right? The one which I think can work here, again, both on the synchronic axis and the diachronic axis. We benefit both from things that happened in the past, let's say slavery again here, as well as things that are happening in the present, let's say global capitalism as it unfolds today. On the far diachronic side, I have a figure that I call the successor. That's something like, in a classic example, I would say the third, fourth generation German after the Holocaust, right? Someone who succeeds this genocidal crime may in some ways be considered a beneficiary, but for me, that seems like a less relevant way of talking about the kinds of responsibility that, say, a young German person today bears toward the Holocaust past. I don't think beneficiary is quite the right term for the most part, though it exists as well. So I'm trying to find a slightly more neutral term for the one who comes after and bears, by virtue again of their membership in a particular collective, in that case the German one, a kind of responsibility for this history of violence. And then again, back in between the synchronic and the diachronic, I have this figure of the perpetuator, which in the book I use precisely to describe that Jewish diasporic relationship to Israel-Palestine, right? I don't consider myself a perpetrator of the occupation, but by virtue of being an American and paying taxes, I am helping to perpetuate it, right? I was raised, as many of us were, within a certain kind of ideology of support for the Israeli state, for the Zionist project, which I think in some ways makes me a perpetuator of what is happening there. But perpetuator, I think, also works nicely for thinking about the question of settler colonialism. And again, here within the US context, the way that we are perpetuating a kind of ongoing dispossession of indigenous people. So there's a place where, sure, certain things happened in the past are diachronic, and yet it continues into the present. It keeps reproducing itself. It's an ongoing fact, and therefore it's kind of at the intersection, a tangled intersection of the synchronic and the diachronic. Now, as I said at the beginning, this will be the last kind of argument that I offer here. The implicated subject is, in my terms, a subject position, and we occupy multiple versions of that. We occupy multiple positions in relation to multiple histories, and those don't all align. In other words, many of us find ourselves with connections both to histories of victimization and to histories of perpetration. And this is what I call complex implication. So life is complicated, history is complicated, but I mean something very specific, which is precisely this relationship, this double relationship, both to victimization and to perpetration. And I think it's actually very, very common. And so I've kind of mapped that out a little bit here as well. And I think this can happen both on the synchronic axis and the diachronic axis. And I think it also happens in relationship to histories of victimization that are unfolding in the present and that we might be direct victims of, but also in terms of what Mariana Hirsch calls post-memory. In other words, the histories of victimization that we inherit. And I'll give you an example right now to try to show you what I mean by that. I think that this is, again, complex implication plays a particularly strong role in a lot of conflicts around the world, but I think it's very much at stake, again, in the Israeli-Palestinian question, because I think, and here, I'm just using this one artwork by Alan Schechner as a kind of illustration. There's a lot more to be said about this work. I do talk about it in the book, but I just want to illustrate what I mean by complex implication and the kind of role that it plays. So as Jews, I think many of us have inherited post-memories of victimization, right? Or even direct memories of victimization, especially coming from the Holocaust, but also from the history of anti-Semitism and other pogroms, et cetera, et cetera. In the Israeli-Palestinian case, those post-memories of the Holocaust come to intersect with present-day implication. And I think that's what's being figured in this artwork by Alan Schechner, which is a video loop in which you first see this very famous image on the left of the Warsaw Ghetto Boy, right, which I'm sure everyone has seen before. And then the video zooms in on the Warsaw Ghetto Boy, and you see that in his hand, he's holding a picture. What is he holding a picture of? It's a picture of a Palestinian boy who is being arrested by the Israeli army or Israeli police. And then the video loop continues, and you start to zoom in on the Palestinian boy, and you see that he too is holding a picture, and you zoom in on the picture, and you see that he is holding a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto Boy, and it kind of loops like this. And again, there's a lot more to say about this. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that from a particular Jewish perspective, you see how you have this kind of diachronic relationship to the Holocaust and inheritance of a history of victimization that intersects with an ongoing present-day synchronic form of implication. I think that's what he's trying to work out there. And so I've tried to then map out just a few examples, thinking about my own work, of how these different forms of complex implication can be distinguished from each other. So I don't want to take up too much time, but just very quickly. So the example I just gave from the Schechner artwork and from the Israeli-Palestinian case would be on the kind of bottom left quadrant there, where you have a post-memory of the Holocaust, so post-Holocaust Jews in the face of a synchronic implication in the Israeli occupation. Another project I've been working on is about Turkish-German immigrants in post-Holocaust Germany. So these are immigrants who are the sort of largest racialized minority group in Germany, victims of present-day structural racism as well as acts of violence by neo-Nazis and others. So they are actually victimized in the present, and yet they enter into a context in which to be German is to bear some sort of diachronic responsibility for, some sort of historical responsibility for the Holocaust. It becomes a very complicated situation to try to unravel that. And I'm not trying to make a judgment about what anyone should or shouldn't do, just to kind of show the impacted nature of a complex implication in a case like that. Or to take another case, I was recently on a panel about a really interesting project run out of Victoria in Canada about Japanese Canadian dispossession. So just like in the US, we had Japanese American incarceration during World War II. This happened in Canada as well, as I've learned more about recently. And one of the things that struck, and there, Japanese Canadians were not only incarcerated for many years, even after the war, all of their possessions were basically taken away from them. They were entirely dispossessed. And yet, as they point out in this project, not in a way that minimizes that victimization in any way, the land that was dispossessed from Japanese Canadians had been in turn dispossessed from the indigenous inhabitants of British Columbia before that, right? So Japanese Canadians are on the one hand victims, on the other hand, are implicated against their will, perhaps, certainly not with their express consent necessarily, but in a larger settler colonial project as well. And then finally, just to give an example of how diachronic implication intersects with post-memory, there I would say something like simplifying American Jews in relationship to slavery. So if you take slavery as a historical injustice with a kind of end point, again, that's a complicated thing to say already, but for purposes of illustration, how do American Jews, again, with their post-memories of anti-Semitism, of pogroms, of the Holocaust, how are they implicated in questions of slavery? Again, you get a kind of complex positioning there. Happy to talk more about all of those or to consider other examples as well, but just to kind of wrap it up very quickly, one of the things I've been thinking more about is the relationship between affect and implication, which I think works on a few different levels, and I think is really important to understanding not only how we understand implication, but how we contest it and how we turn against it. And here's actually where I'm thinking of Atalia's work on Jewish American activists, where I can see some of these questions playing out. So anyway, as far as I've gotten so far is to think that affect works on three levels in relationship to implication. On the one hand, affect can be itself a medium of implication. So patriotism, love of country, and hatred of others is already a form of implication that works precisely through affect. There's also then the reaction on the part of implicated subjects to their implication, which I think is often unconscious, but perhaps can also be conscious, fully conscious as well. And I think this manifests itself, especially in resentment, right? I think resentment is such a powerful affect that we are seeing in such important ways in a lot of different places around the world, leads very often directly to violence. And I think to me is a kind of unconscious reaction against a recognition of implication. And I think guilt and shame are other affects that are very powerful there too. Again, as either conscious or unconscious recognition that one is implicated. And I'm interested in the book as well, is how one then can turn against implication. How can activist projects grow out of a sense of one's own implication, react and attempt to transform and to transfigure the world so that there's at least less implication, less violence, less injustice than there was before. I think there are people who've offered guilt and shame as in fact motivating forms of affect in these cases. I think that's possible. They're not the ones that I pursue. Again, in thinking about Atalia's work, I was also thinking about the love as an affect, which can be a motivating force in various activist projects. And again, autobiographically for myself, it's precisely when I feel that something unjust is being done in my name, that I become very angry and that I then become active in trying to overturn those relations of implication. So this is for me just a kind of hint of some topics I think are worth pursuing more and that I'd be happy to talk about more. But I will stop here and look forward to Ernesto's response and to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, and amazingly brief. Professor Verdeja, Ernesto.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This is really a phenomenal book, and the presentation itself was so rich. As I was thinking about questions and comments in the aftermath of this presentation, I kept thinking to myself, well, he actually answers this in the book, so it's a little unfair. But of course, this isn't a reading group. So some of the questions might, I'm going to shunt those off to the side. And instead, I'll try to leave some space for folks to ask their own questions. But as I was preparing for today, I was thinking, I was reading the news today and I was thinking about some of the questions in the book. And I was thinking about how just in the past week and a half or so, we've seen massacres in Colorado and in Atlanta, which brings up questions about implication through this idea of tolerance for gun violence, right? So this kind of implication that we have as Americans. But also in the news, we see that Evanston, Illinois, for instance, is putting forth a program on reparations for the historic marginalization and denial of access to decent housing to African Americans, a remarkable recognition of what we could consider kind of the status of implication in this particular community. And we're seeing a movement around these types of issues in the United States. They tend to wax and wane a little bit, but nevertheless, we seem to be at a really important moment. So in thinking about this, I was thinking about what the numerous strengths of this book that you've put for us. And I just wanted to identify a few things, and I'm going to jump into some questions. And what I'll do is I'll give you the questions. I'll just kind of lay out all the questions, and then you can run with them as you wish, given that undoubtedly there are people in the audience who ask questions as well. In terms of the number of strengths of this project, what I really find especially provocative is this notion of expanding beyond the standard categorizations of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. But it allows us to move away from the notion of a narrow understanding of accountability, which has always been one of the concerns, even among people working, for instance, in transitional justice. But anyone who deals with memory and justice for historical atrocities is always concerned about narrowing accountability, not only because it provides an inaccurate understanding of the past, but because it lets a lot of people off the hook, so to speak. So this idea of implication forces us to continue to confront the question of accountability in more sophisticated ways. And it also encourages us to think about mourning, but mourning beyond the kind of narrow understandings of mourning. You kind of explore this throughout the book in a number of ways. And it draws us instead to think about how to analyze structures of power. So focus less on individual guilt and responsibility, as important as those things are, but instead think of the subject as a transmission belt, this kind of language that you use from Fortini. And this is an entree to thinking about structures of power. And so what we come away with is this notion of implication, which is not about basing responsibility on a consciousness of entanglement. You don't have to necessarily actively, consciously accept your entanglement or your place in it, though I noted that even in your comments at the very end, you said there's nothing that makes me angrier than when someone speaks in my name. That, of course, is a recognition that speaking in my name already elicits a response. You've been interpolated in a particular way, and that elicits this particular response. But as you note, the idea of implication really encourages us to think beyond the consciousness of entanglement as a requirement for responsibility. And I also really like this structuring of the argument around diachronic and synchronic axes, which I won't go over because you presented them very nicely and succinctly just now, so that ultimately memory becomes a resource. Reading this book, I thought a lot about Levinas, one of my favorite philosophers. along with Hannah Arendt, another famous favorite one, and along with Karl Jaspers, of course, but Levinas in particular, who tells us that ethics begins when we are confronted with the other, the face of the other. And yet justice begins when we are confronted with more than one other, when we have to make decisions about our obligations and responsibilities towards various others, introducing this idea of social responsibility and our kind of commitment, our throwingness in the world into a set of webs of relationships with others. So I just found this book to be really quite powerful. Let me jump to the questions so we can get to that. I'm going to start off with what I think is kind of the bigger, more complex question, and it's really more of a philosophical, conceptual question. But the question is this, it's really two questions, of course. God forbid it just be one. The first question is this: is implication, and the way that's laid out in this work, a constitutive feature of subjectivity? Or can we conceive of a future political community or political communities without implicated subjects? If the former, then implicatedness is part of the human condition, right? This is kind of tied to this notion of what it means to be a person as intersubjective. And the best we can hope for is to mitigate injustice. But nevertheless, implicatedness is not surmountable because our self is always already implicated. So this means basically that we're thrown into a world of complex responsibilities and implications, which cannot be overcome, but they're mitigated. So that would be, if we take the first tack that says implication is a constitutive feature of subjectivity. If the latter, though, if we can conceive and advocate for a future political community without implicated subjects, then the possibility of a condition of non-implication, even if it's utopic, it serves as a horizon by which we can orient our actions so that non-implication becomes an emancipatory horizon towards which we orient ourselves. Something along the same ways that, for instance, non-exploitation and solidarity are the fundamental features of freedom in Marxism, right? There's a vision there, even if you can't quite achieve it, you have a sense of non-exploitation, here a condition of non-implicatedness. So the first question is kind of how central is implication to subjectivity? Is it a core element, or can we imagine a post-implication world, even if practically speaking, it's a significant challenge? The second question is about artistic representation. And one of the things I really love about your book, one of the many things I love about it, is the ways in which you engage aesthetic representation and artistic representations about these difficult questions. So you talk about art as figurative, dealing with figures, right? And as a resource for thinking about implication. And my question for you is this: must the art of our age be characterized by something like a dialectical negativity? Just thinking of Adorno here. But in other words, must art always bring tensions to the surface as a response to the false reconciliation of modern political ideology and identity? That is, the world is not reconciled because ultimately there are all these relationships of domination and of responsibility that we don't acknowledge. So does this mean that a fundamental function or responsibility of art itself is to bring these tensions to the surface? In other words, throw out your Norman Rockwell, your calendars and stuff, because that's a false ideology, it's a false reconciliation. And instead really bring back these types of artistic representation which are all about bringing contradictions to the surface, a non-reconcilability. So that's the second question. I have a bunch of other ones. I'm gonna ask one more. May I ask one more, if that's okay? Okay, thanks. The last one is this. You say on page 50, the theory of implication and the implicated subject foregrounds entanglements between subjects and social structures. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a number of cases where you talk about international actors kind of, involving themselves in domestic politics elsewhere. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about what this might look like. So I'm thinking about, the United States involvement in Iraq, right? But how do we think of the responsibility, the implicatedness of Americans in the United States who their subject position is such that they are really widely marginalized? They're impoverished, they suffer from structural violence, et cetera. There are people who really realistically can't exercise significant political power and political voice because they already experience the repression of the state. How do we assess this varied understanding of implicatedness? Is it by looking at the synchronic status and variations in synchronic status? Or is it by taking seriously variations in diachronic status and kind of the historical consequences of where people are? How can we work this out? you talk very nicely about it in the context of Israel and the occupied territories. I was wondering if you could say something from this other perspective. And you don't have to use the American Iraq example, but it's just something I was thinking about. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Great. I just want to remind the audience to submit your questions. We already have a few lined up, but now I'll give Professor Rothberg an opportunity to respond to the rich thread of thinking that is on the table already.
Yeah, so let me just say thank you, Ernesto. That was very rich and really covering so much and so many things that are obviously important to me and showing both a really deep understanding of what I'm trying to do and asking some difficult questions. So I really appreciate that. Linking it to, to what's been happening around us, which I also, of course, have been thinking about a great deal as well, including the one good thing, which is the Evanston reparations case, which I've just read a little bit about this morning. So I don't know a lot, but I was excited to see that and feel like or hope that it will really open up further efforts along those lines, which I think are so important. Where can I begin with these really big questions, which I'm not sure I can entirely answer, but I'll make efforts. So your first question was about whether implication is a kind of fundamental feature of subjectivity, which can only be mitigated, or whether it's something against that we can hope to, let's say, negate in order to produce a kind of world without implication. If I can put it, that's a much less eloquent way of saying what you said. And it's a version of a question that I get a lot, though not usually with such sophistication. And so it is something I've been thinking about. And I guess what I would like to say is that I don't think that I think in terms of essential features of subjectivity. So I think my tendency is to argue for the second option, which is to say that I guess for me, subjectivity is fundamentally historically and socially constituted. And therefore, there is a possibility for a kind of radical transformation. And therefore, I like this, and this is sort of close to the way I think of it, that relations of unimplicatedness are a kind of utopian horizon toward which we strive or should strive. And I guess I'm not naive or so overly optimistic that I expect us to get there anytime soon. But I do feel like that's an important, I don't know if it's a regulative ideal, if this is the right way to talk about it, but in any case, a kind of horizon, as you say, toward which our work should proceed. I don't think that we will get there in sort of one dramatic move or moment. And so while I believe in the necessity of qualitative radical change, I think I don't believe that there is sort of one revolution that will take care of all of the problems that we're faced with. And here, as you know, in the book, I'm inspired by the Combahee River Collective statement and vision, and which is in some ways kind of the origins of intersectional thinking. And I can, I don't really have time to go into why I think that's so important for thinking about implication, but one of the things that your question reminds me of is, when they say we are socialists because we believe that capitalism is an exploitative system, that needs to be overthrown, but we don't believe that if capitalism were overthrown, our position as women or our position as Black women will automatically be righted at that moment. So I guess I believe that these things are historical and social, that implication is historically and socially constructed, and needs therefore to be undone socially and historically. But that undoing is complicated and has to proceed along multiple axes, multiple temporalities, will take multiple forms. But that I like the idea of at least holding as a kind of ideal this horizon of unimplicatedness, which is somewhere in the future and guides us in a certain sense. And I guess for me, that's one of the reasons why actually it was interesting to hear you talk about Levinas. Levinas has not been such an important thinker for me in recent years, I guess. Though I like that definition of justice that you introduced. But it does seem to me in Levinas, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's a kind of, I mean, there is a kind of, well, no, okay. Let me step away from, before I say the wrong thing. Let me step away from Levinas. Let me go on. I don't want to get myself in trouble, but maybe we can talk about this more later. Let me turn instead to artistic representation. Here again, I guess I'm not so much interested in an essence of art, as I'm also not interested in an essence of subjectivity. You know, I approach art and I use art in my work, one, for very obvious disciplinary reasons. I'm trained as a literary and cultural critic, and so this is sort of where I go to you know, for my evidence in a certain sense. But primarily, I guess I go to art as a way of theorizing and thinking, and that art offers, I mean, that art, I think, is itself a form of theorization, or can be itself a form of theorization. And what I'm looking for in the artworks that interest me are precisely complicated ways of thinking about these sorts of questions, about violence, about injustice, et cetera. And so somebody like William Kentridge or Hito Steyerl, I think they're doing really complex and theoretically informed things with their work, working through the particular mediums that they use, which maybe are different from ours as scholars, but yet where we can find inspiration, I suppose. But I guess I don't want to say that I think art must do that sort of work. I'm happy when it does. I'm happy when I discover work that does that. Certainly, my vision of what important artwork is artwork that does precisely what you described in terms of bringing certain kinds of tensions to the surface. And so Adorno has certainly been an influence on me. But I guess when I think about, you know, when I do work on cultural memory, for example, I'm interested also in art that maybe doesn't do those kind of complicated dialectical things, because that art also matters in the world and has, you know, has real effects, you know, again, whether we like it or not. And sometimes even despite not being great art, it can still actually have interesting and potentially positive effects. I was thinking for other reasons recently about the Holocaust miniseries, right, which was famously described as basically a trashy, you know, inaccurate, historically inaccurate, sentimental work of late 70s television. And yet the impact that it had in Germany, despite that, was actually quite radical and transformative. And scholars have talked about the fact that the airing of this Holocaust miniseries in Germany in 1979 was the first time that as a collective, Germans really were able to empathize with Jewish victims. And that this in some ways launched this famous project of German coming to terms with the past. Another complicated issue that we could talk more about in another instance, but again, the work itself was not particularly dialectical, certainly not negative in Adorno's sense. Adorno would have hated it, and yet it had an interesting and productive effect. So, you know, that's what I'll say there. Let me see, your last question about the way, yeah, I think this is a very interesting one about, so as Americans, as taxpayers, right, we bear responsibility for the wars that our country fights for, you know, in Iraq, wherever around the world, and for various other things, of course, that it does as well. What about the fact that within the US, you have people who are themselves marginalized and victimized in all sorts of structural and other ways? How do you bring those things together? I think that's a really important question. In some ways, I don't have an answer for that, except to say that this is why I think the category of complex implication is so important, that it provides at least an analytical clarity for us to say, look, this is what's going on here, right? That we have these complex lines of connection, both to you know, ongoing forms of violence and to ongoing forms of victimization. Now, how you calculate precisely, you know, the effects of those different axes, I don't really know, and I suppose I think you need to I think we need to reflect on this in some ways on a kind of case-by-case basis. And certainly my project is not about ascribing guilt to people or producing guilty feelings, and certainly not for people who are themselves victims of other forms of violence, right? That's not at all my project, but rather kind of offering an analytical framework through which we can try to tease out some of these complex positions in which many of us find ourselves in. And so this is, you know, for example, in my project on migration and memory in Germany, this is, you know, one of the core elements. Like, what do you do about people who are themselves racialized minorities, racialized subjects, who nevertheless occupy a space in which there is this great historical crime that took place just a couple of generations back? And I don't want to say those people are innocent of some form of implication in the Holocaust in this case, right? By virtue of being in Germany, of being German, however contested your status is, I do think you bear some sort of responsibility, but that responsibility certainly does not override or cancel out the forms of marginalization and victimization you experience every day. And again, I'm not trying to say you must do this, you must do that, but rather let's look at the situation in which this is unfolding so we get a better understanding of it, and then start to think about how we unpack this and what forms of responsibility might or might not be relevant there. You know, I think it's important to have a differentiated perspective on those sorts of difficult questions. But I think those sorts of difficult questions are very common. They're sort of ubiquitous around the world. And so let's at least face them and shine some light on them so that we can then attempt to kind of work through them in their particular contexts. I think I'll stop there for now because there may be other questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ernesto, again. There's more to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, some takeaway points will be kind of deploying a differentiated lens, recognizing complexity and nuances and real kind of like the notion of the victim and perpetrator is not an essence and an identity. It's something that I think is very important. It's really important to grapple with, especially within the spaces of peace studies that we kind of engage. So one question that I have here is from one of our PhD students in peace studies, and Josephine. So she writes, "Thank you, Professor Rothberg, for this thought-provoking presentation. I'd like to hear your thoughts about the intersection of colonialism and implication. I'm thinking, for instance, of combatants from European colonies implied in fighting on behalf of colonial powers and other colonized places. Another example I'm currently working on involves the recruitment of co-ethnics as counterinsurgent in civil wars and the pitting of indigenous communities against one another. How would you conceive of these subjects?" Yeah, and which relates to a lot of kind of many of the threads that are already on the table.
Right. Yeah, no, I think those are great examples of, you know, similar to some of the ones that Ernesto was introducing, that I was in his third question that I was trying to address just a moment ago. I mean, I think these are forms, again, of, you know, well, I'd say, first of all, these are forms of complex implication, once again. And I think one has to work through the specificities of the different cases, right? So, you know, again, my point would not be, at the end of the day, I mean, I do value complexity, I value nuance, I value moving beyond binaries, all of those things that Atalia just mentioned. I mean, that is absolutely essential to me, you know, sort of theoretically and methodologically, but I also recognize that simply saying things are complex is not itself a satisfactory answer. And I think that, I think that complexity has to be worked through in the different cases. And we have to think about what are the elements of coercion and consent that go into producing these kinds of complex figures like the ones that are mentioned in the question. So colonial soldiers, you know, counter people who are solicited into various forms of counterinsurgency, perhaps even against their own communities. Again, because I'm trying to shift from a discourse of guilt to a discourse of responsibility, part of what I am trying to do is to broaden our sense of what we are responsible for, while being precise about how we are not in the realm of guilt and we're not in the realm of criminal guilt, if that makes any sense. So I'm trying to get people to see that their responsibilities are perhaps greater than they have thought they were, but that this doesn't entail prosecution, the ascription of criminal guilt. I think also importantly, it's an attempt to move beyond moralizing discourses, which manifest themselves, I think, often in these kinds of complex and politically charged situations. So my perspective is really one that is trying to also, move us in some ways beyond the legal realm. Again, not to abandon it entirely necessarily, but to say there's so much that doesn't fit into the kinds of frameworks that we get from a legal system in terms of guilt, et cetera, or innocence for that matter. But also outside of a moralizing realm in which admitting implication or admitting responsibility is the occasion for some sort of moralizing condemnation or what have you. Again, it's more trying to understand, how do systems of violence work? How do structures of violence work? How do histories of violence happen, and what kind of legacies do they leave? And for me, at least, this notion of implication, working both kind of synchronically and diachronically, is first of all, just like, I hope, a contribution to understanding how those things propagate themselves, how we prop them up, sometimes against our wills, how we inherit and live within the legacies of these forms of violence, which don't just stop right at when an event ends, but live on, as we know very well, in cases of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I think what I would first say is that this kind of solicitation of the participation of those who are victimized in further victimization or even their own victimization, the first step is simply to identify that this is the way that structures of power work. And here, I would draw on, again, coming from Holocaust studies, someone like Elie Wiesel and his notion of the gray zone, right? Which was Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, that is a really bad slip. Primo Levi and his notion of the gray zone, which was precisely a study of the way that even in the most extreme circumstances of the death camp, the Nazi camps, the perpetrators solicited the participation of the victims in their own destruction, right? And that even in this extreme situation where you would expect a binary relation between perpetrators and victims, what you actually have is this gray zone, which is characterized by multiple forms of division and gradations of guilt and responsibility. And I think it's simply starting from that kind of assumption that these matters are going to be complex and gray is a way of approaching these sorts of very difficult scenarios of the sort that the student is working on. And so again, I would need to know the exact, you need to know more about the particular histories at stake, but I think trying to break out of the binaries, trying to break out of a guilt-centered and moralizing framework is important, at least to elucidating some of those cases.
Yeah, thank you. This is very important for us to always kind of center in our analysis, be specific, disengage from this moralistic discourse, and think in concrete ways about on a case-by-case basis. I'm going to introduce two questions, and they'll be our final questions. So I'll put them because they're very different. So I'll put them both on the table, and you take them and run with them. All right. So the first is from Cristina Avila, who is a Mexican journalist. She writes, I specialize in peace journalism. Thanks for your time. Fascinating subject indeed. My question, I'm always interested in the implications and the role of media, above all mainstream media, to make worse or better, and the apparently endless narrative of victims and perpetrators, good and bad, white and black, etc. How to deconstruct this kind of media and journalistic approach and narrative to our actual reality. So a media and representation question. And another question that I'm not sure who is it from. I suspect a student, just because I think I know who the student is. Dr. Rothberg, Holocaust education in the US in the last 10 years has begun frequently using the language of bystanders versus upstanders to instruct on the lessons of the Holocaust. The Holocaust Museum Houston defines an upstander as simply someone who stands up for others, Would you please comment on the implications of adding those additional categories to the established categories, victim, perpetrator, bystanders, and I suppose the implicated subject? Do you see it as a possible way to access your framework of implication?
Thanks. Yeah, two really interesting questions, and as you say, quite different from each other. I mean, in terms of the media, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that media narratives, and I suppose therefore media actors, journalists, etc., are themselves implicated in the construction of these kind of overly binary, simplified narratives of victims and perpetrators, which often are hiding more than they're revealing, right? Which are sometimes can be distracting us from some of the underlying and more difficult issues. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me, though I'm not someone who works in the media or particularly a specialist in thinking about the media. I mean, I guess I'm interested then. I mean, I guess I take the question of narrative here as the essential one. And I guess that's, again, coming at it as a literary and cultural critic and thinking again about Ernesto's question earlier. This is where I see the role for literature and art, right? As being able to offer different kinds of narratives, maybe more complicated narratives, maybe more ambivalent narratives, to throw another, I think, important word into the mix here. And I would want to believe that that is also possible in media formats, right? In more mainstream media formats, that journalists are also able to tell more complicated, far-reaching stories that don't just sensationalistically focus on victims and perpetrators. So I do think that's possible, and I'm sure that it happens. And if I thought more about it, I could probably come up with some specific examples. So I certainly don't think that can't happen within the realms of journalism and media, but I guess for me at least, I tend to find those alternative narratives in works of art and culture. And that, I guess, is a nice way of describing what I value about them, is that they provide alternative narratives to some of those dominant narratives, because I do think it's true that stories of victims and perpetrators are certainly, or simply, more narratable on the surface than tales of implicated subjects. And so I think it's true that a lot of our media productions, including art and television and film, various forms of cultural narrative, often use those figures as well. And so I've tried to search out in my work a kind of archive of artists who are exploring implication specifically. Again, I'll mention Kentridge, for example, who I think does this really, really nicely as a kind of white Jewish South African artist thinking about apartheid and the transition after apartheid, and exploring his own, again, ambivalent position as a white subject in relationship to these transformations that are going on, and is able to tell a really complex story that doesn't simply reproduce those kinds of binaries at all. So I do think it's possible. I think it's also possible in the realm of journalism, but I think that's something journalists themselves are going to have to create, I suppose. In terms of the question of Holocaust education and bystanders and upstanders, I mean, again, I guess I wouldn't say the category of the bystander is totally irrelevant. I don't want to throw it out entirely, but I do find, for me at least, that we need a stronger category, and that's why I offer implicated subjects there. Those who are not simply passive, or whose passivity is in fact actually a form of activity, a form of perpetuation of certain forms of violence. So for me, I would substitute implicated subject for bystander. In terms of upstanders, yeah, I think I do think that's important. And I guess for me, this is sort of getting at what I was trying to evoke at the very end and bringing up the question of affect and how it is that we go from being implicated to contesting our implication. So for me, an upstander is not a term that I would necessarily use myself, but it could be another name for the implicated subject who becomes conscious of her own implication or his own implication, for their own implication, and starts to act against it. I mean, I think that is a good way of describing that. And I do think that moment of self-reflexivity is really important for me. The first step is to recognize that one has been and perhaps still is implicated in certain forms of violence, and then to think about how you can contest that, in what kinds of solidarity you can offer, what kinds of alliances you can join. And for me, the sort of forms of solidarity that I offer in the book are what I call, somewhat indistinguishably, and again, I think this is something that needs more work, differentiated solidarity or long distance solidarity. I'm interested in the forms of solidarity that are precisely not the natural and organic ones, right? Not the ones that emerge because of our belonging to a particular group, which is somehow seems to be naturally or obviously constituted, but how we reach out across the borders of our identity and start to form alliances with subjects are different from us, in maybe far from us, and yet still feeling the effects of our actions or inactions. That's the sort of long distance side of it, and forming alliances that are not based on strict identification, but rather a grasp of how we are differently situated. And to me, those are the most important forms of solidarity, and the most important alliances that can be founded are those that are self-conscious about our own implication, and then are sort of reaching out across the boundaries of identity, that cross the identity subject positions in which we are situated, and trying to make links with other groups and to join in together with others in some sort of struggle for justice.
Yeah, I just want to add that this is exactly what I observed in my kind of ethnographic work with American Jewish Palestine solidarity activists. I observed how their, the ethical outrage that they experienced when they saw the occupation, it wasn't like an instinctual. They needed to do a process of what they called unlearning. So unlearning the narrative in order so that they can see, so that they can be outraged and be evoked and provoked to see their implicatedness. But then most critically, that in ways that connect to your argument, their responsibility in standing in kind of a process of being a part of a process of co-resistance to, in this particular case, the occupation, and how it does things in their name as Jews. So I think it's very powerful, and in fact, it's operative and observable, but the narratives are not, to be outraged and to see implicatedness, it's not something that is automatic, because a lot of unlearning has to take place to kind of denaturalize the ways in which things are justified. So thank you so much, Professor Rothberg, for highlighting for us this concepts of complex implication, this notion of the ambivalent subject position, and also this understanding of art and literature as for re-narrating, for reimagining. It's something that I personally really connect with. And thank you, Professor Verdeja, for offering your response, and for all the amazing questions that came through, and we could only touch on a few. So obviously that's a sign for a really good conversation. So thank you for joining us today, and yeah, let's applaud.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you both so much. It was very productive for me.
Yeah. All right, and hopefully next time in person.
Yes.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.